Hey everyone, this is Roberto Blake, and today I'm going to be telling you how you become a web designer. Now first, a little background. You can check out my website at www.robertoblake.com. This is a website that I hand-coded, and part of the reason I did that was to show off some of my skills as a web designer that codes primarily by hand. A lot of websites today are done with content management systems like WordPress, and my blog, if you've been following that, is the same. It's something that uses WordPress. It's a content management system, but I actually did a whole lot to customize the theme that I used in that, so I practically rewrote that from scratch in HTML, PHP, and CSS. Which was a little challenging to do, especially when I was first getting into WordPress a few years ago. So, I just did this primarily as a way of not only showcasing my work, but showcasing what my actual capabilities as a web designer were in a very, straightforward way. But it was also to focus on my own ideas of minimalism in web design, and I'll get into that in this video down the road. The point is, I wanted you to understand that I've been doing web design since I was 14 years old, which means I've been literally doing it for more than half my life. I got back into this in the days of AOL 6.0. So that's where I'm going to be coming from. I'm going to be coming from this with knowledge of being self-taught, learning this from scratch. The fact that when I went to college, web design still wasn't a big thing yet. Web design is still a fairly young profession when you think about it compared to the rest of the graphic design industry, and so the information available on it, despite the fact that we do have the web and it's as broad as it is still very limited in some ways, and a lot of the information is very repetitive. So I'm going to try to avoid that in this particular video and cover some things that I think are very important and that get very much overlooked. And the primary one is the fact that most web design advice and most web design lectures come from people who were first and foremost coders. And I don't say that to be disparaging or derogatory toward coders. I have a lot of friends who are coders, and at one level I am considered and do consider myself a coder, but I'm not what you would call a coding purist, because I was an artist first and I was a designer first. And I was someone who was into print and photography and graphics well before I was into web, even though I started at such a young age, but that's because I come from a family of photographers and artists and illustrators. So again, perspective. I say all that to say this. There are three types of web designers. There are designers, which means that they're primarily designers and value aesthetic first. There are coders, which are more technical and value code and functionality above all else. And then there are designers who value business. And the difference with the third compared to the other two is these designers are focused on whatever it takes to accomplish the goal using the best tools, methods, or strategy without a preference for either. And if I were going to fall into any category, I would either fall into the third category of being a business-oriented designer or a design-oriented designer. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that throughout the video. Now, with all that being said, one of the first things you have to do as a designer, in my opinion, is before you write a line of code, before you do any wireframes or mock-up, is you need to understand what the project is. And that requires what's called a design brief or a creative brief. And this is where you talk with either the client or your department head or whoever you're working with or for on this particular project about what the project's requirements are, what the goal is, what the audience is, and what if they're available, the technical requirements are, or if you have freedom or constraints with that. And it's important to do this before you do anything else, because frankly, if you don't know what you're supposed to accomplish, you can only fail. Unless you get lucky. You can only fail if you don't know what something is supposed to be. If you design something for an audience of 20-somethings, but it's actually intended for an audience of 40-somethings, then the result is going to be way off, and it's not going to accomplish what it needs to, and it's not going to be effective, and it's going to be disappointing, and it's going to be a bad experience all around. So it's important, and it seems like that would be common sense, but you'd be surprised how much this gets overlooked and the questions that people fail to ask when starting an assignment. So do that first and keep that in mind. The next thing we're going to go into is, again, before you write any piece of code, once you understand what the project is, you need to design first. This is called web design, not web coding, for a reason. when people go to a website, the first thing they see is not the beautiful semantic correct standards-based code. They see a layout, they see a design, they see typography, they see colors, they see images, they see arrangement, they see positive and negative space. They see things that are either spaced too far apart, things that are crunched together, things that are easy to read, or things that are difficult to read. Design is the first part of the user experience that an end user interprets. And the problem with being a code purist or a coder first is that you may be worried about the functionality or how someone uses the website, which is very important. It's extraordinarily important. But they won't even get to that point. They won't even click on anything if they're immediately turned off by the way the website looks, or find it difficult to use in the fact that they can't even read anything, or the fonts are jarring or ugly, or the colors are literally physically hurting their eyes, as some websites actually tend to do. There are very important aesthetic concerns to functionality. With regard to user experience, form is function. If you don't like how something looks, you won't even get to a point of finding out whether it works or not. That's just the way things are. That's just the way people are. So if you don't design something first, if you don't make sure it has a strong layout, readable, legible typography, good positive and negative space, visual balance, and that it's easy to read, it won't even matter how well you code it, how well it works, what functionality or capabilities it has, because no one will be able to stand to look at it for 5 to 10 seconds long enough to find any of that out. So you do have to design first. And with that in mind, before you even think about opening up Photoshop, I recommend using a notebook of grid paper and actually doing some layout. And I actually recommend presenting this layouts to whoever you're going to be working with, whether it's a supervisor or a client, and getting their approval on placement. Because once you have to code these things, or once you have to mock them up in Photoshop, changing the placement of them can be very difficult sometimes, or it can be very frustrating, and you don't want to have to go to the nth degree of revisions when you can sort this all out on pen and paper and get it done very quickly and get the decision-making process out of the way. As a web designer, if you jump into the code right away or into mocking things up in Photoshop, the odds are you can end up doing a whole lot of work that won't amount to anything, because the client just won't approve it. And if you had gotten a decision first, one way or the other, you wouldn't have to undo all of that work or feel like you wasted your time. One of the other things you can do, especially if you're on the coding side, is you can create what are called your own personal code libraries and startup projects, which means that if you tend to work in projects that tend to have similar clients, similar criteria, etc., a lot of what you are going to be doing is going to be repetitive, and you're going to know a basic flow, and the odds are you're going to have recommendations that are very similar to other results that you had to produce that were within the same type of framework. So with that being said, you can save yourself a lot of time by doing prep work, by having your own personal templates, not ones that you've bought, although there's nothing wrong with that, but having a setup of, okay, to do a project, I always do these basic things, and then whatever those things are, or I always use these scripts, or I always use these web fonts, or I always use these combinations of types of image sizes, etc. Things that you do to establish your own standards will help you. Providing yourself with shortcuts, especially if you think the revision process could be intense, is definitely going to be something that you should use to your advantage and that you should think about doing. But with that being said, you can take some alternative routes to this in terms of using established frameworks already for web design or web development. You can use things like CodeIgniter, you can use CakePHP, Smarty, WordPress. Those things are a little more complicated and technical, but they do exist to help you. From a WYSIWYG side, you can use layout templates, you can use free ones, open source ones with Creative Commons licenses. You can use WYSIWYG editors like Adobe Dreamweaver that have starter projects built into them in terms of grid-based layouts, responsive design, etc. There's some more of these within the Adobe Exchange that you can get from other people who've produced them, or you can buy online templates and assets from places like ThemeForest. And again, there's nothing wrong with doing this if this is what it's going to take to get your project done, and as long as you have a transparency model with your client where you told them what you're going to do and they've said that that's okay. It's not good to take someone else's work and resell it as your own. That's a bad practice, and there's problems that go with that, so I'm not recommending you do that. What I'm saying is there's nothing wrong, and don't let people demean you by saying you shouldn't use templates. You need to produce the result that your client wants, and whatever means you choose of doing that within ethical bounds and legal bounds is entirely appropriate. This is a business. Now, if you're doing this purely as a hobby, then you can be a purist one way or the other all you want and use whatever guidelines you want. But if you're doing this as a career or for employment, you need to open yourself up to the idea that you should do the most effective thing you can with the most minimal amount of effort on your part, because you want to work smart, not hard. You don't get anything extra for working hard. I hate to break it to you, but that's just kind of the way it works. Now, I'm going to bring up something I think I touched on a little earlier called Adobe Muse. Adobe Muse is a visually based editor where you could actually produce a fully functional website with even some moderately advanced features without having to write a single line of code. Now, a lot of coding purists have come out against Adobe InDesign, and I'll cover this in another video. I have an article on my blog that talks about my thoughts on Adobe Muse, but the point is Adobe Muse exists for a reason, and it exists for a specific market. And the thing that coding purists don't understand is the frustration that somebody coming from the print world or coming from the advertising or marketing world has to deal with sometimes in working with them. And I'm not saying that to be mean or rude or demeaning. I'm talking from personal experience on both sides of this. And it's a real issue, and I want to address it for those of you who are young and want to become web designers so that you understand this going in. If you're doing web design and you're working within the advertising industry, or you're working with people who are more visually oriented or come from a print background, they live in the world of results, whereas programmers and coders live in a world of results that are based on abstracts. These are people who live in a world of results based on things they can put their hands on and things that they can see visually and comprehend. So coding is not something that's very conducive and friendly to them. They don't understand those things. What they do understand is they understand layout, they understand color, they understand type, and they understand presentation. And when you don't put those things in front of them, they become uncomfortable, they become agitated, and they wonder what they're paying you for. And this is why a lot of web designers who are very good at what they do, who are coders, sometimes struggle with clients because they don't understand the concept that they need to offer these people reassurances and not just wish that their clients were more technically savvy or inclined so they can understand them. They need to be more empathetic to the client. That being said, this is why I like Adobe Muse. If you're working with someone that's more visually based, less technically savvy, or a layman, someone who just wants to get their business up and running online, they don't need a lot of fancy bells and whistles. They don't need, super perfect semantic code. They just need a website. And the fastest way of producing that and giving them visually something that they can grasp so they can tell you yes, no, bigger, smaller, blue, not red, use this font, use this type, is a tool like Adobe Muse, which can allow you to do all of that in seconds. Screen share it with them if you happen to have a computer that's capable of that, and get decisions done and approved in real time, or with them standing over your shoulder and say, yes, I like that. That looks exactly like what I want. And you can just click export and it's done. And it's a fully functional website ready to be uploaded. Not, okay, to change this thing, it's going to take me 20 or 30 minutes because I have to rewrite the entire code and I have to apply it to all these different pages and I have to do that. No, it's none of that nonsense. It literally comes back down to the same page layout concepts of Adobe InDesign. So if you're working with someone who comes from a print or advertising or marketing world, using a tool that's more similar to something that they're familiar with may not be what you have in mind as a web designer, but it is something that would make your life easier and allow you to produce a result that your client is going to be happy with. So if that is the genre of websites that you're going to be producing, I highly recommend using that tool while at the same time learning Adobe Dreamweaver, so that when you have customers and clients that want more technically based results, want some custom functionality, and that really do need an inclusive and true web design solution rather than just something that is presentation driven, do that. When it's all about presentation, use a tool that has a basis in presentation. When it's about functionality, use a tool that allows you the most flexibility in producing that functionality. Use the right tool for a job, and don't let someone tell you that if you don't do this, you're not a real web designer. A real web designer is someone who designs the websites that their clients are happy with. Nothing more, nothing less. The means to accomplishing that end are completely irrelevant. It comes down to you and your ability to use the tool effectively. Well, that video was more long-winded than I intended, and more long-winded probably than any other video in this series. But I hope you guys learned something from it. I hope that coders won't necessarily flame me in the comments for just calling out some things, but it is a reality that is addressed, and I know that some of you have experienced with that. I've worked with enough of you to know what the realities of the situation are from both sides, and I'm empathetic to it. I grew up coding. I grew up coding by hand in Notepad, for Christ's sakes. So it's not as if I don't get it. And it's not as if I don't get that coding is also more reliable in producing a consistent result. I absolutely understand that. The reality, though, is that the 99% of people who are viewing websites don't care, and they don't understand that. And so would you rather frustrate yourself trying to do it right for the basis of, from the perspective of the community, or do it right for the people who are paying you and from the people who are using it and interpreting it? It comes back down to a discussion I had about the difference between art versus design and the difference in the intent between the two. It's very similar in that regard. But anyway, that's enough on this topic. Like the video if you like it, subscribe, share it, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.